Welcome to this lecture. My name is Thomas Sterner. I'm a professor of environmental economics from Gothenburg, and I'm going to talk about climate challenges for transports. We are not on a path to 1.5 degrees, and not even 2 degrees warming. Unfortunately, the challenges look very difficult, and we are on a path more like 3 degrees or more. In order to get to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, other low goals, we would need to do a very drastic reduction. As you can see in the IPCC figure here, which I have drawn here to true scale. And you see at the left part of the diagram, the dramatic and almost straight linear increase in emissions that we've had from 1960 to 2020. The tiny little dips you see are world crises like the oil embargo or financial crisis or COVID, but they basically do very little to bend this linear increase in emissions. To actually reach a goal of stabilizing the climate, we don't need to stop increasing the emissions. That's just the first step. We need to reduce emissions to zero, because this is a stock problem. Now, look at the thick, straight black arrow on the right, basically reducing our emissions now to nothing in 2040. That would be necessary to stabilize our emissions at, say, 1.5 degrees. Very few people are so optimistic that they think that it's possible. We hope, some optimists hope that we can stop the growth of emissions and then reduce rapidly in the period from 2030 to 2050 so that we get to zero mid-century. That would not be enough to get us to 1.5 degrees. But if it is combined with large negative emissions, then it would probably be enough. But those are, of course, difficult. It's hard to imagine that we would suddenly go into big negative emissions. So the latest IPCC Working Group 3 report shows, in fact, that there are options available now in every sector that can at least halve emissions by 2030. This applies to energy, land use, industry, urban dwellings, houses, buildings, transport. I don't have time to go into each of these, but would just like to mention one or two and start with the energy, particularly the electricity production sector itself, where we have the most best news available. That is, in fact, that the price of photovoltaic cells has fallen extremely fast. The price of wind power has also fallen fast. And that also, in fact, applies to batteries. So in this sector or these couple of sectors, there are good news, very good. Even in difficult, iconically difficult sectors like steel industry, we see some good news. The color here shows you that this is hot. And the heat, of course, itself means that large amounts of energy are needed. But it's not only that. In the steel industry, you also need carbon dioxide emissions as a necessary part of chemistry. At least I believe that some decade ago. And most people I talked to said, well, of course, you need carbon dioxide emissions as a part of the chemistry when you are reducing, knocking off the oxygen molecules, the atoms from the iron ore. But it turns out you can use hydrogen for reduction. Of course, this implies lots of new engineering and physics, and it's taken a decade of hard work and enormous investment, billions of dollars. The Swedish in large companies, steel companies, mining companies, energy companies have all joined forces and had generous support from the states and produced projects like hybrid. We have already made some steel that is fossil-free. And Volvo has symbolically used some of that steel to make vehicles. So these vehicles, there's one truck, one car, passenger car. They are both battery electric, so that they are electric in that sense of the word and fossil-free. They are also made from steel. This is improvement, no doubt. However, there are still many challenges, and transport is one of the really difficult sectors. It's difficult to and will be expensive to meet the tight timetable we have for emission reduction in this big sector, and some parts of it are more difficult than others. But there are many promising technologies. Some biofuels that can be produced in a sustainable way, some electrofuels, new exciting combinations where hydrogen and carbon dioxide are used with renewable electricity to produce fuels. We also in Sweden have a large number of policy instruments that are intended to affect both the choice of vehicle and the choice of fuel, driving patterns. And this applies also to the whole of Europe. It's particularly important for heavy-duty vehicles to think of this, because see the panel to the left is for light-duty vehicles, the panel to the right is high-duty, heavy-duty vehicles, and the share of the vehicle costs is, of course, smaller for heavy-duty vehicles that are basically operated almost round the clock, round the year. And as a consequence, the fuel costs and other running costs are more important. And so the pricing costs of fuels is particularly important for heavy-duty transports. Now, suppose we managed to rebuild all the houses, redo the energy sector, change the industry, not only steel, but cement and all other industries. Would that be enough? And this is where the economics comes in, because we actually need a systemic solution. Just looking at each technology, sort of one technology at a time, and looking at lawnmowers one day and regulating them, and then looking at trucks another day, and then the cement industry and the electricity production and fertilizer production and so on. This is always, will always be looking at yesterday's problem. And if we attack each of the demand sectors one at a time, then there is a big risk that we just lower the equilibrium price of oil, coal, and gas on the world market. And if we do that, then people and firms, either here or in other countries, will find new ways to use fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are very useful. All kinds of new chemistry will be new products. I can't tell you which, because they haven't been invented yet. But you can be sure that we can invent new products, new technologies, new supply chains that use fossil fuels. I have a couple of light-hearted suggestions here. I mean, there could be new ways of making fertilizer. There could be bitcoins, and there could be more heated jacuzzis in the Arctic. But it's up to everyone's imagination. Now, the only instrument, policy, that will deal with new uses is a systemic policy, like a taxation or setting of a higher cost for fossil fuels at the general level economy. So it's very important that we have a tax on carbon or trade permits for carbon trade. And quite a few countries have this, but so far we cover perhaps a quarter or less of world emissions. The green blocks here are tradable permit schemes. The EU is the biggest one, yes. Many of these have prices that are too low. Sweden has the highest carbon tax in the world over here, but that's of course a very small share of world emissions. And there is significant resistance to pricing carbon. Carbon pricing would be the cheapest and most efficient policy. It would save us enormous amounts of cost. And you would therefore think that it would make climate policy, ambitious climate policy, more easy. But unfortunately, there is, of course, considerable resistance. First and foremost, from the lobbyists of the industry. Those who sell fossil fuels will always resist taxation. Secondly, the man on the street, as we have seen in France, also resist. So, in many cases, also do the truck drivers and the profession have often led the protest against fuel price changes. I therefore looked a little bit. The accusation is often made that fuel taxes are bad for the poor. And I wrote a book about this with some 40 different case studies from different countries. And, well, this is an empirical question. It could be bad. The fuel taxes, in fact, probably are a little bit regressive in a country like the United States. But in most European countries, as we'll see, they are fairly neutral. So this is the way we judge the progressivity or regressivity of fuel taxes. On this diagram, we have on the horizontal axis, we have income deciles. So income decile 1 is the poorest tenth of the population. And income decile number 10 is the richest. On the vertical axis, we have the percentage of expenditures used on fossil fuel. And if the curve points upwards, that means the rich use more fuel, more of their expenditures on fuel, and the tax would then be progressive. If they point down, then it would be regressive. These curves are simply described as quite flat. So in Europe, generally, we find that fuel taxation for transport is a fairly neutral tax. In most countries in the world, which are, of course, the low-income countries, we find that fuel taxes are very strongly progressive. As you can see here from Kenya, it is only the richest 2 deciles that use fuel, that have cars. And so a tax on fuel in Kenya is a tax on the richest fifth population. It should be good news that assumes that the poor understand a lot about tax incidence, and of course, typically the poor have not studied economics. So we also need to think about fairness between countries. We don't have a world government, and this is a global problem. we need global policy making. And at the moment, we have separate decision makers in every country. And India, for instance, is acutely aware of that. This particular week, large parts of India are approaching 50 degrees centigrade, and the earth is scorched. People die of heat. But India also says, we are affected, but we did not cause this problem. And they are right, as you can see here. See here the per capita carbon emissions in different countries. And you see India and Africa have virtually no emissions compared to other countries. China and Europe have average emissions, and the highest emissions are in countries like Russia, States. So India says, we didn't cause this problem. We don't need to have this problem. Saudi Arabia says, if you're picking on the only product we have, we would be glad to do solar energy in the long run, but we need economic support and compensation. If we're not allowed to sell our oil, then we would like to be compensated and get new technology, and then we would sell solar energy. And of course, there's not a lot of sympathies with Saudi Arabia, perhaps because they're very rich. The same thing happens in Russia, Mexico, South Africa. Some oil countries like Nigeria or Indonesia actually have large low-income populations, and they need all the money they can get to grow and industrialize. At the last COP in Glasgow, there was actually a deal struck to help South Africa. South Africa would be given some $8.5 billion to help retrain coal workers, compensate mine owners, and so on. And this is an example of how countries want special treatment and compensation. Even the United States, this is true. We must have the United States on board for climate policy, global climate policy to be meaningful. Yet this particular body that you see on the picture here is the US Senate. They are not very favorable to climate policy. The US Senate is rather lacks in proportionality to population in the United States, because California has the same reputation as really small states with just 1 million people, and the states with large fossil resources, oil, coal, or gas, are overrepresented, and so they also want special treatment. We have all the countries of the world want special treatment. Even the French motorists want special treatment. Everybody cannot be given special treatment. Someone has to actually pay it. Today, in the midst of a horrible and dramatic war, where, of course, our thoughts go to the Ukrainian people, and other considerations are secondary. But still, one of the dramatic things that's happening in Europe today is that politicians are feeling sorry for the motorists. So they are lowering taxes on fuel. Fuel prices has gone up due to the war. But we must understand that lowering this tax is like sending a check to Putin and the other producers of oil, coal, and gas. It's the same thing with the requirements we have to use alternative fuels in the fuel mix, which in Sweden is called reduktionsplikten. That also, there are many politicians who want to lower the requirement to use a, we would call a fuel blending mandate. But if you use less vegetable oils or alcohols or other fuels, you use more of something, and that is oil. So this is also supporting the oil producers. And a sensible policy today would do the opposite. What happens in the world, in the large world of climate change, is really depends on what happens in the biggest countries, China, United States, India, and others. What we can do in a small country in our corner of Europe is to show examples. Our policy can show that we can live a good life with less emissions, less fossil fuels, and ultimately no fossil fuels. And research programs like FFF must help us show alternatives. These alternatives may be organizational, they may be policy instruments, they may be technical things like electrofuels or improvements to vehicles, battery technologies, and so on. This is a very important and useful contribution. Thank you.